So many literary journals these days could use your help. So please consider a donation. And now I'd like to introduce Ronald Spatz, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Alaska Quarterly Review, a professor of English at the University of Alaska. Ron is a former National Endowment for the Arts Fellow and the recipient of 2 Alaska Governor's Awards and a contribution to a literacy award from the Alaska Center for the Book. Under Ron's 4 decades of leadership and vision, Alaska Quarterly Review has created strong connections between Alaska and the larger literary community in the US and abroad. And AQR has been influential in supporting new and emerging writers, as well as presenting works that include a rigorous question of larger societal issues. Ron?
Yeah, thank you, Heather, and welcome everyone. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few important acknowledgements. Alaska Quarterly Review is grateful to the Anchorage Museum for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and Web 907 for its web support, and to the Alaska Center of Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. AQR is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by traditional present and future caretakers of this land. Land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of indigenous peoples and marks our collective movement toward decolonization and equity. And now to begin, Heather Lindy will introduce today's featured writers, Eliese Colette Goldbach, Malcolm Garcia, and Tracy Kidder. Heather is the author of 4 books, all published by Algonquin. If You Lived Here, I'd Know Your Name, Take Good Care of the Garden and the Dogs, Find the Good, which is this year's Alaska Reads book, and her most recent published book, Of Bears and Ballads. Heather?
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, it's really a privilege just to be in the same Zoom room with the writers today. And Elise is going to read first. What I'm going to do is I'll introduce all 3 of them at once, and then we'll go through and each one will read some. We may have a little conversation at the end, but it's going to be a really incredible hour. Eliese Colette Goldbach is a young literary nonfiction writer who's worked as a steelworker in Cleveland. Her highly acclaimed memoir about her experiences doing that is Rust, a memoir of steel and grit. Her essays have appeared in Ploughshares, Western Humanities Review, and McSweeney's Internet Tendency. Her stunning and heartbreaking Alaska Quarterly Review essay, White Horse, about a brutal rape and sexual assault was subsequently selected for the Best American Essays in 2017. She's received the Ploughshares Emerging Writers Award and a Walter Rumsey Marvin Grant from the Ohioana Library Association, which is given to the young Ohio writer of promise. And she currently teaches at John Carroll University. Elise was born to a working class, devoutly Catholic family. She grew up in Brooklyn, attended Corpus Christi and St. Augustine High School, where she was the valedictorian in 2004. And before she wrote Rush, she told an interviewer that she had been writing about her sexual assault in childhood and religion and the way religion combined with politics, and that she had hoped to do a memoir about losing faith and finding it again, and that she found it in an unlikely experience of working in a steel mill. I write about my life, she says, as a way to give me a sense of purpose and meaning. Being able to write about the steel mill after a shift gave it meaning. Malcolm Garcia is a journalist and author who's traveled the country and the world. His books include Khaarijee, A Chronicle of Friendship and War in Kabul, What Wars Leave Behind, The Faceless and Forgotten, Without a Country, The Untold Story of America's Deported Veterans, Riding Through Katrina with Red Baron's Ghost, A Memoir of Friendship, Family, and a Life in Writing, and Fruit of All My Grief, Lives in the Shadows of the American Dream. His essays that often read like short stories have appeared in Virginia Quarterly Review, McSweeney's, Mother Jones, West Branch, and various other publications. He grew up in Winnetka, Illinois, and now lives in San Diego. A self-described late bloomer, he was an actor and a social worker before taking a job as a reporter at age 40. He says, "There's no reason 18-year-olds should know what they want to do in life. Some people do, and that astounds me. I tell parents to let their kids just run around for a while, do it while they're young. And then when you find out what you want, and it may take a while, do it with passion. When you reach the end of your life, you don't want to be wishing you'd done something. You don't want a huge bucket list." Garcia is a recipient of the Studs Terkel's Prize for writing about the working classes and the Sigma Delta Chi Award for excellence in journalism. His work has been anthologized in the Best American Travel Writing, the Best American Non-Required Reading, and the Best American Essays, for an essay that appeared in Alaska Quarterly Review. Tracy Kidder, well, the Raleigh News and Observer notes that Tracy Kidder is probably one of the few authors alive who can craft a narrative from the extremes of despair and hope and make it work beautifully. He's a master of creative nonfiction, employing both journalistic and novelistic techniques to tell a true story compellingly. And I would say that all of our writers today do just that, combining fiction and nonfiction in a way that tells a story. Born in New York City in 1945, Kidder spent his childhood in Oyster Bay, Long Island, where his father was a lawyer and his mother was a teacher. He earned a BA from Harvard and served as a lieutenant in Vietnam, for which he was awarded a Bronze Star. An experience chronicled in his memoir, My Detachment. Sorry, you get the pun there. Anyway, after the war, he earned an MA from the University of Iowa, where he attended the Iowa Writers Workshop, and it's there that he met Atlantic contributing editor Dan Wakefield, who helped him get his first assignment as a freelance writer. Over the years, his articles have covered a broad array of topics, including railroads, energy, architecture, and the environment. His writing has appeared in the New Yorker, Granta, the New York Times Book Review, you name it, as well as the Alaska Quarterly Review. He's the author of 10 best-selling and highly acclaimed books, including The Soul of the New Machine, Mountains Beyond Mountains, House, Among School Children, Old Friends, Hometown, Strength in What Remains, A Truck Full of Money, and with Richard Todd, Good Prose, The Art of Nonfiction. In addition to winning the Pulitzer Prize, Kidder has also won the National Book Award and the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award and the Ambassador Book Award in American Studies and many other accolades. And today he's coming to us from his home in Western Massachusetts, where he lives with his wife. And Elise is going to read first, and I understand she has her husband with her. So welcome.
Yeah, so I've been reading a lot about the steel mill lately, so I wanted to do something a little different today. I'm going to read a very new piece that I've been working on recently called Erosion. And the piece has kind of two rapidly alternating voices. The first voice is from like my 16-year-old self, who is sitting at a park with her mother. The second voice is my perspective 16 years later, as I'm standing at the edge of Lake Erie. So I will be reading the 16-year-old perspective, and my lovely husband, Tony, here will be reading the later perspective, and hopefully it'll all kind of click into place. But I've never read it before, so we will see how it goes. So this is the beginning of Erosion. 16 years old. It's too warm for mid-March. That much is obvious.
16 years later, it's too wet for early summer. That much is painted in mud on my boots.
I sit at a picnic table at a park with my mother, avoiding her gaze.
I walk on the edge of a small bluff beside Lake Erie, marveling at the way in which the waters have risen.
Robins and blue jays call to one another in sharp trills and cat-like screeches, and a little boy plays on a swing set beneath the trees. His legs dangle helplessly, too short to pump his body upward, so his father pushes from behind.
Record high rains have fallen this year, and the effects are visible. Waves crash against a break wall, snatching up chunks of concrete as if they're pieces in a game of jacks.
Higher, higher, the little boy begs, squealing every time his body arcs towards the sky. My mother and I listen in silence. She brought me to this park after Sunday Mass, just the two of us, to talk. We are caught in a push and pull of our own.
Huge portions of the earth have been eaten away from the shoreline, revealing craters of black soil that look desperate and raw. Something about this erosion reminds me of pictures I've seen in head wounds, when a bullet exits a skull.
Why are you crying? My mother asks, her voice hesitant.
I think of bloodied caverns open just above the neckline. I think of fissures and clefts in the skin. I think of a scientific study I once read about in self-inflicted gunshot wounds. Sometimes, if the blast is severe enough, the brain will fly out of the skull and land a few feet away from the body of the deceased.
Why are you crying? My mother asks again. What can I possibly tell her? For months, a blanket of gray has covered Cleveland with slush and misery and sudden squalls of snow. But now the sun beams through the clouds, radiating over the muddied grass, the salt-stained pavement, the bone-thin squirrels searching for the remnants of the caches they made last fall. The sudden burst of daylight feels nearly obscene to the sun-starved, but I drink it in anyway. I believe it's the last light I'll ever see.
I know it's not normal to think of suicide while standing at a park on the lakeside. It's not normal to spend your nights poring over autopsy photos of suicide victims, trying to divine the amount of pain one feels when the gun fires, or the noose tightens, or the tank of nitrogen gas lulls you to sleep.
Earlier this morning, I rooted through the household chemicals in the basement until I came across a bottle of drain cleaner, which had a skull and crossbones on its side. I poured myself a glass and headed back to my room.
I know, for instance, that a shotgun in the mouth is better than a handgun to the temple, and a handgun to the temple is better than a jump from a bridge.
With the drain cleaner in hand, I turned my head towards the ceiling and whispered a prayer. This is all I can do, I said, bringing the cold glass to my lips. Then, with my head tilted back, I poured the drain cleaner down my throat as if I were nothing more than a clogged pipe.
I know, for instance, that a jump from a bridge is better than just about anything you can find in a musty old basement.
Why are you crying? My mother asks for a third time, a little louder than before. I don't answer, not immediately. The drain cleaner bypassed my lips, my mouth, and my tongue, but now it burns in my stomach. A blue flame has opened up inside me. A white hot piece of iron has sprouted below my ribs.
I want the craters in the earth to remind me something other than suicide.
Tears drip from my chin and cheeks, but I steady myself.
I want the craters to remind me of pockmarks or cupped hands, but the city has surrounded them with red caution tape as if cordoning off a crime scene. The caution tape flaps in the wind, repeating a single word: danger.
At any moment, the drain cleaner could overtake me. In an instant, it could all be over.
A chill rain will come again tonight, adding gallons to the lake, cutting soil from the earth, putting a damper on summer plans.
On the other side of the park, the little boy laughs from his swing set. Higher, higher, he says into the March sun, sweat beading on his forehead. It seems that the winter is breaking.
The weather, it seems, has broken.
I am here, breaking with it.
I sidle next to the red caution tape that flutters beside the lake, my boots sinking slightly on the muddy grass.
My mother knows nothing of the drain cleaner, the skull and crossbones, the warning label on the side of the bottle, may be fatal. I don't tell her a word. I keep my mouth shut.
I want to witness this erosion.
Her face looks pale and drawn in the midday heat of March.
I want to get a closer look at the wounds in the earth.
I read into every wrinkle, every laugh line, every furrow in my mother's brow, each one a reminder of the pain I've caused.
I walk closer to the damaged shoreline, a cold mist stinging my cheeks.
This bout with the drain cleaner isn't my first suicide attempt. It's not my second either.
It's more than curiosity I feel at the rising waters. I've read about the threatened species, the melting glaciers, the rising sea levels. I've heard of the erratic weather patterns, the island of garbage that's as big as Manhattan, the strange disappearance of the bees.
I've been killing myself to escape a sickness.
I've been reading the book of Genesis.
Desperate for release.
Humans were given dominion over the animals and the earth, or so the saying goes. I used to believe the word as a child, but nowadays I make a living in big industry where carbon dioxide is released by the ton.
My sickness is simple. I stuff myself with anything I can find in the kitchen cupboards. I eat until I'm ill, and then I vomit it all into a toilet in the basement.
I work with the gases, solvents, the byproducts that are poisoning the waters.
Handfuls of almonds and fistfuls of crackers and sagging dollops of crunchy peanut butter all turned to bile in my mouth.
Sometimes I scroll through the company-wide newsletter that outlines environmental breaches. The scrubber went out on the blast furnaces for 2 hours, it says. 1,000 gallons of red liquid has leached into the Cuyahoga River, it says.
It can't be helped.
The oil slicks, the chemical spills, a sea of plastic headed for landfill.
I can't stop the binges, the purges.
Sometimes I mention the environment to my coworkers. We need green technologies, I tell them. We need to limit our footprint. We need to restrict emissions.
I'm an addict, the doctors tell me.
We need, I tell my coworkers.
Lines of vomit always dribbling down my chin.
I stand on my soapbox for everyone to see. Meanwhile, a big paycheck from big industry is being deposited into my bank account.
Bulimia, the official diagnosis.
It's a small gain for a huge loss, a fleeting reward in exchange for something that can never be made whole again.
My parents have been paying thousands of dollars for me to see doctors and nutritionists and shrinks, but everyone knows that I'm relapsing.
I run my fingers over the red caution tape, wondering if this erosion is part of a larger shift in climate. Most of my coworkers would argue with me on this account. Global warming is a hoax, they'd say.
Just a few months ago, I tried to kill myself with a motley assortment of medications in the family bathroom. Aspirin, Tylenol, random decongestants. I ate the drugs greedily, drinking water straight from the tap, but nothing ever came of it.
Climate change is a conspiracy, they'd say. It's an elitist plot to make money, they'd say.
The pills made me sick, so I puked them up in the bathroom and told everyone that I had the flu.
Climate change isn't real, they'd say. It's a fraud, a con, a bit of fake news.
Now I'm at it again, searching for death in a bottle of drain cleaner, trying to break free of what ails me.
Now I'm here by the lake, pretending concern for this erosion.
Here, waiting under the hot March sun.
Here, admiring the swollen waters that have been battered by my industry.
Hoping the poison does what it promised.
Thinking fondly of the lake until the start of tomorrow's shift.
Tell me why you're crying, my mother says from her seat at the picnic table, her voice softer than it has been in months.
I run my fingers over the red caution tape, tracing the word danger, noting how easy it would be to slip right past.
I don't know what to tell my mother.
The waves swell beside me, and I'm struck with a sudden desire to throw myself past the caution tape and onto the eroded soil below. It's less of an urge and more of a compulsion, this feeling that I might not be able to prevent myself from casting my body headlong into peril.
I can already feel the drain cleaner do its work. The pain in my stomach is a rush of heat, melting every cell, every synapse, every pore.
I get this sensation every once in a while, on bridges, on cliffs, on the bluffs beside Lake Erie.
It's a pain that defies language, a pain that only exists in the far out reaches of the mind, somewhere beyond reason, beyond structure, beyond words.
Don't you ever feel like you might just throw yourself off the top of a building? I asked my husband once. He stared at me in dismay. Other people feel it too, I told him. The French even have a word for it.
A pain that makes me feel like a solid thing sinking.
The appeal of the void.
Memories flash through me like snapshots from a projector, the label on the bottle of drain cleaner, the tiny skull and crossbones, the prayer before the deed, this is all I can do.
I want this erosion to remind me of something other than suicide, but everything circles back to it. The headshot holes in the earth, the siren call of a sharp fall, the lake eating the soil that doesn't belong to it.
My head tilted back, the cold glass of drain cleaner against my lips.
The memory of eating what I shouldn't have, the scars left as a result.
The words on the bottle may be fatal.
Drain cleaner isn't like arsenic or hemlock. It doesn't poison. It erodes. It burns away your flesh until there's nothing left.
I imagine my body dead on the kitchen floor, on the bathroom floor, on a gurney in a hospital. Maybe death will happen here in this park, beneath the sunny skies that warm the picnic table. Maybe it's so close I can taste it.
The death caused by drain cleaner can take days, weeks even. The liquid breaches a hole in your intestines, causing food and bile to spill into your abdominal cavity. Pain ensues. Infection follows. Sepsis seals your fate.
I imagine the morgue, the autopsy, the casket, the funeral.
The lake churns below me, every wave rolling into a whitecap, every whitecap sucking a mouthful of soil into its stomach. I want this erosion to remind me of something other than suicide, but everything comes back to that moment in the park after the drain cleaner. My eyes locked on my mother's eyes.
I imagine the eulogy, the hymns at the gravesite,
The sun dappling the mud-spattered ground.
the pallbearers, the memorial cards,
our brows moistened from the winter heat.
the hearse, the undertaker, the smell of lilies in the funeral home,
How the drain cleaner burned from the inside.
how devastated my mother will be when I am gone. Thank you. And thank Tony.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just kind of taking a little breath there. And Malcolm?
Okay. Well, I just wanted to start by thanking you all for inviting me here. It's a real privilege to be with Tracy and Elise, and thank you, Ron, for the opportunities you've given me over the years in appearing in AQR. And it's great to be at an event that's celebrating the magazine in its entirety. It's a great effort that you put out. I certainly appreciate the opportunities you've given me. Speaking of AQR, I'm going to read from a story that's in the current issue. It's called Mother's House. It takes place in Afghanistan. It's about a woman who owns a restaurant and uses the proceeds to fund a detox center for Afghan war veterans. At the same time, when I met her, she was trying to get her children into Europe with the help of a smuggler. Mother's House. The Taj Begum restaurant stands behind a gate on an exhausted dirt road in Kabul, the crumbled asphalt exposing rocks and tree roots and gaping potholes. Passers-by, burdened by the intense heat of an August afternoon, walk on the road until they reach a stretch of sidewalk that has somehow survived its own ruin. On rainy days, muddy water fills immense craters cars can do little to avoid, slaloming around one only to sink into another with a horrible bang of the undercarriage, sending geysers of filth and dousing anyone, on this morning me, outside the closed metal gates of the restaurant. Upon seeing me drenched and dripping, sunlight blinking off the wet concrete drive and my own soaked body, a guard hurries to let me in. He offers an apologetic smile and hands me a towel. Wiping my face, I enter a courtyard. The high white walls reduce the street noise to a whisper, and it would be easy to think that I am no longer in Kabul, but some peaceful place without war or strife of any kind. Cats dart across a lawn, and iron lanterns with stained glass throw a wavering blue and orange light that provides minimal heat for other cats to bask in, and roses stand to one side of the lanterns in pots ready to be planted. I watch a barefoot man step across the grass with a hose and amble around tables and chairs that another man washes and stacks on a brick patio. And I'm reminded of scenes from a fairy tale where elves scurry in preparation for their monarch. I intend no pejorative, but there's just something so subservient about their conduct, hurried and stooped over. The restaurant, a two-story brown brick building with white columns, like something out of America's antebellum South, casts a long, wide shadow over the laborers, enforcing the morning stillness with the quiet solemnity of its vacant windows and empty dining hall. As I hand the towel back to the guard, Layla Hadari, the proprietor, approaches me, wrapped in an orange and red sari. A scarf of the same color covers her black hair. She has a firm handshake and a warm smile, and I feel her tired eyes search my face as she sizes me up, determining whether I can be trusted. Men, I will soon learn, have not treated Layla well. I follow her to two lawn chairs and sit in the sun and observe a couple of men emerge from within the restaurant to assist the other two tending the grounds. They're all graduates of an alcohol and drug detox program Layla founded across town. The profits from Taj Begum keep the program open. Before I became a reporter, I had worked with homeless people in San Francisco. When I heard about Layla's work with addicts from a friend with Amnesty International, I decided to look her up. Don't forget the rose bushes, Layla calls to the man watering the grass. Yes, mother, he says, and jogs to the roses. All the recovering addicts call Layla mother. She compares them to eager children who want to make their parent happy. Grown men behaving like needy kids discomfort her, but she understands. Few people care about addicts. The men cling to the ones who do, their affection something so rare that it becomes almost as addictive as the drugs the addicts once used. They can't let her go. Some refuse to leave even when they complete the program. They have become so used to her care that they make their way to Taj Begum and insist she continue to watch over them. Come on, Layla tells them. You're sober. You have your shops and families to return to. No, you're our mother. We're your kids, they tell her. She insists they go, but they resist, and she absorbs their profanity, their rants like spoiled children. Until exhausted, she relents and lets them stay, assigning them tasks at the restaurant. Her brother Hakeem also cursed her, but for different reasons. He became envious of her success. Hakeem had been an addict for 22 years, hooked on heroin and hashish. As a family, Layla and her parents experienced the shame of his addiction until their father banished him from the house. She remembers seeing him on the street, passed out. Alive or dead, as an addict, her brother no longer existed, no longer mattered, an unwanted non-person, just like other addicts, whom she would chronicle in the early 2000s as a documentary filmmaker. However, Layla increasingly became disillusioned with making movies. A film did not change lives. In 2010, she put aside her camera and established a 30-day drug and alcohol recovery program. She offered a house, 3 meals a day, and Narcotics Anonymous meetings. The first few clients began calling the program Mother's House, and the name stuck. Hakeem stayed for a month, and now he no longer uses. After he left, he started his own program. He considers Mother's House competition. They haven't spoken in years. 2 years after Mother's House opened, Layla tried to help addicted women, but she received so many death threats that she dropped the idea. The women and their children transported drugs and guns for the dealers they lived with, most of whom were their husbands and fathers. And the dealers confronted Layla and demanded that she stop encouraging their women to leave. You're interfering with business, they told her. One night, someone kicked in the door of her home. She woke with a start, but saw nothing. Then 2 men emerged from the dark, and one of them jumped on top of her and began choking her with a wire. Layla pushed the fingers of one hand beneath the wire, and with her other hand reached for a gun she kept by the bed. The second intruder grabbed the gun, and they struggled. Layla pulled the trigger once, twice, blasting holes in the walls, and her assailants beat her until she released the weapon and passed out. When she opened her eyes, the men were gone. Above her stood a neighbor who'd heard the commotion. When he entered Layla's house, the startled intruders shoved past him and ran outside. Layla did not call the police. An attack on a woman, even in post-Taliban Afghanistan, was of no consequence. Another time, a taxi driver offered Layla a ride as she walked to the restaurant. 3 men sat in the back seat. It is not uncommon in Afghanistan to share taxis with strangers. Layla opened the passenger door and got in. One of the men grabbed her scarf and jerked her head back and punched her, while the other men demanded that she stop helping addicts. Addicts bought their drugs, they shouted, hitting her again and again until they told the driver to stop. One of the men then stepped out and jerked Layla from the taxi, throwing her on the ground. This time she went to the police, but they did nothing. Drug dealers, she suspects, paid the police to stay out of their way. To this day, the threats have not stopped. Her phone rings in the middle of the night. When she answers, she hears only a taunting silence. She began to worry about her 2 sons, 18-year-old Murtaza and 13-year-old Mustafa, and her 15-year-old daughter, Zakia. It was one thing when they were small and stayed home, but now they are old enough to wander about Kabul as they chose. These crazy people might kidnap them or worse. In addition, the children's stepmother wanted Zakia to marry a man Layla felt was mentally unstable. Her children were just 4, 6, and 8 when Layla divorced their father, but they stayed with him because according to Sharia law, Afghan children belong to the father. He married their stepmother a short time later. She resented having the responsibility of children not her own. Some days she would lock them out of the kitchen and refuse to feed them. Layla became obsessed with worry until she arrived at a plan. She must get her children out of Afghanistan. Without criticizing his wife, Layla told her ex about the threats on her life and how their children might be affected, convincing him they would be better off in Europe. Layla then paid a smuggler to make the arrangements. She put in 1,500 euros and her husband 8,000. She coached her children on what to say at the borders they would cross. Don't tell anyone your father is alive and lives in Iran, she warned them. Say he disappeared. If border agents know your father lives in Iran, they might deport you to Tehran. Afghanistan is dangerous, Iran is not. The Europeans might think it's no problem to send you there. That would be terrible, Layla knew. Their father was a mullah. The Europeans would not understand how hard it would be for her children, especially her daughter, to live with a conservative man and his crazy wife. And because the children are part Afghan, they would suffer discrimination. Iranians consider Afghans inferior. Their father could not protect them. Murtaza, Mustafa, and Zakia left by bus 2 days before I stood soaking wet outside Taj Begum's gates. If they are on schedule, they would soon cross into Turkey. There, a man the smuggler knows has promised to help them reach Austria. You will have a hard journey, Layla told Zakia before she departed. After what we went through with our stepmother, this trip won't be so bad, Zakia replied. I'll stop there.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now I want to know what happens at the end though, so I better open up my new AQR. Tracy?
Yeah, is this working? Yes. I'm sorry. I want to read from a book that I wrote with my best friend and editor of 47 years who died a year ago this April. Was a man named Richard Todd. Just to give you an idea of how dependent I was on him as a writer in almost every other way. The day after he died, I reached for the phone, honestly, intending to call him to ask him how I should deal with his death. But we fashioned this little book called Good Prose, and I'd like just to read from it just because it reminds me of him, partly. Also, this is a little piece about a young man who's part of our family now, who came from an African country called Burundi, who turned out to be an extraordinary writer, I think. And I'll tell you a little more about him when I finish. This is really about him and about memoir. This is the chapter from the chapter in our book about memoirs. The desire to tell the truth haunts the serious memoirist, and so it should. But there is a step beyond truth. For the writer, the ultimate reward of memoir may be to produce a work in which the facts are preserved, but the experience is transformed. In A Fortunate Man, a meditation on the working life of an English country doctor, John Berger writes, "Perhaps this is the true attraction of autobiography. All the events over which you had no control are at last subject to your decision." Writers in all genres are attracted to the promise of control over past events, if by control one means creating form or finding patterns in a life or a mind or the world, and in the case of memoir, finding a road through the wilderness of one's past. Some memories cry out for this kind of control, as in the case of a young man with a painful past who had a powerful story to tell, but was uncertain about whether to tell it. His name is Pacifique Irankunda. He grew up in Burundi, a small African country long beset by civil war. His parents, farmers and herders, were virtually illiterate, and yet they valued education, and Pacifique managed to attend grade school, often in peril from trigger-happy soldiers. He did well. His test scores were among the country's highest and earned him a secondary school education. Then at 19, Through a series of improbable accidents and charitable acts, he was brought to the United States, where he spent a year before college at a private secondary school called Deerfield Academy. English was still strange to him when he arrived. He was fluent in French as well as in his native language, Kirundi. He had never read a great novel or poem, but as a child, he conceived a fondness for the kinds of stories that elders had traditionally told, mixtures of fact and fiction that the elders always claimed were true, with complicated structures leading invariably to a moral. A frequent lesson of the elders' stories was the importance of discretion. Pacifique came from a culture that values silence, and so by training, he was disinclined to tell his new schoolmates much about his past. Moreover, he worried that American students and teachers would be afraid of him if they knew about the violence in which he had grown up. They might think that it had left him violent too. But as he learned more English, he began to set down some of his experiences. When his teacher, I was his teacher, told him that some of what he had written was damn near publishable, Pacifique said he only wanted to improve his English. The very idea of making his stories public seemed to frighten him. He worried that his stories were unfit even for me to read because they contained so much horror. I tried to reassure him, telling him that art had the great power to transform the experience of suffering and injustice into something beautiful. This idea made a strong impression on Pacifique. In one of the stories he wrote, he called it The Color of a Sound. Pacifique begins with a glass breaking in the dining hall at Deerfield. The sound triggers a memory. His native village is being attacked on, this is a quotation, "One of the days my mother apologized to my brother and me for having given birth to us." His family's house is burned down. He and his mother and brother spend the night hiding in the forest. In the morning, standing near a clearing, Pacifique witnesses the killing of a young schoolmate named Patrick. The boy has been tricked into approaching a rebel soldier. The soldier is holding a glass. The soldier drops it on purpose, and the glass shatters. Pacifique explains a superstition in his country that if you drop something you are eating or drinking, you may blame a person near you for wanting it. The soldier accuses Patrick of having wanted his drink, then orders him to pick up the shards of glass and put them in his mouth. The soldier forces Patrick to chew, then shoots him in the forehead. The story ends this way. Because I had seen so many killings and would see ones even more horrifying, I thought I would forget Patrick's. But 11 years later, when I arrived at Deerfield Academy, Patrick returned. In the dining hall, whenever I heard a glass shatter, I did not think of the superstition. I thought of Patrick's mouth full of glass and would see him trying to bite. My mouth would be full of food and I could not take a bite. It was as if the food in my mouth had become the pieces of glass. When my fellow students heard a sound of a glass breaking, they knew someone dropped a glass and they would laugh at that person's clumsiness. When I heard the sound of a glass breaking, I would not laugh. I would see a red color instead, the color of blood in Patrick's mouth, a color no one else could see. During the his first year in America, involuntary memories were an important problem for Pacifique. The dreadful things he could not banish from his mind, gusts of memory that could come at any time. 2 years later, he felt that something important had changed. While writing, he said, he had discovered a partial defense against his memories. That's how it started, he said. I wrote a story and I felt relieved. I could control it. In the head, I could not. It's as if you had your hands on it and you could control it and make it beautiful. So instead of its having power on you, you had power on it. When it comes as a memory, it dictates to you, it controls you. After I wrote that story about the breaking glass, I would hear a glass breaking, but it never came back that way. I mean, I would remember what happened, but it was never as before. I would think of making some modification in the story to make the story better. Then if a memory woke me up, I would get back to sleep by writing it down, thinking I could turn it into something beautifully written. I mean, that's what I wish. He didn't show his stories to other students. He still wasn't eager to make his past public, but he wasn't afraid of that anymore. He was afraid that other students would tell him the stories weren't well made. And because their command of English was superior to his, he would be obliged to believe them. Most writers are vulnerable to criticism. It is hard to imagine one more vulnerable than Pacifique. Writing had been a great discovery for him, a defense against the invasions of memory, a way to get to sleep. But when he wrote stories that included the horrors of his past, he had to believe that the stories were well made or could be remade until they were. Otherwise, memory would regain its hold. If it isn't well written, he said, it's as if it comes back into you. Many writers have spoken about memoir as a way to objectify experience, to get clarifying distance between oneself and one's past. But that was not precisely what Pacifique intended when he spoke of having power over his memories, nor is it the highest use of memoir. One can also use memoir to get closer to the past. The memories that surface suddenly, merely unpleasant for most people, horrifying for Pacifique, are bolts from a bigger storm, capricious, even random. If you can go back to the source and see your memories whole, you can create truer versions of what you remember. You tell the stories as accurately and artfully as your abilities allow. If you succeed, you replace the fragments of memory with something that has its own shape and meaning, a separate thing that has value in itself. The past becomes an assertion that your life is of the present and the future. Taking the undifferentiated materials left by the past and giving them pattern and form can be, more than solace, a source of great pleasure. The delight that memoir can offer is like the delight a woodworker may feel when putting the finishing touches on a beautiful desk. The desk is different from the wood forever, and the good memoir is different from the memories behind it. Not a violation of them, but different, and different, of course, from the actual experience that gave birth both to memory and to memoir. I'll just say, his book will come out next fall with Random House. The title comes from a Burundian saying, which is the tears of men flow inward. I recommend this guy's writing highly, obviously. That's all I have to say. But again, I wanted to echo what Malcolm said, which is to say it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. To meet you, all of you, only one I know is Ron. I've known him for far too long. And I do wish AQR well. So.
Well, thank you all. And, obviously it's a kind of a different Sunday than the other ones previous to this, because there's been a change in the world. And we've encouraged the writers who've joined us to have a little bit of free-flowing conversation before the end of our hour. And I'm hoping that you all will do that as well. And one of the sort of prompts or the thoughts to the conversation was we had been using was Louise Glick's comments that writing is a kind of revenge against circumstance too, bad luck, loss, pain. If you make something out of it, then you've no longer been bested by these events. I don't know how much that fits today or not, but I guess what we asked everybody is that, in light of everything, that's going on in the country and the world, how are you doing? And what do you think the role of writers is right now? And feel free to just sort of have a conversation among yourselves about that if you choose.
I don't know. I don't know what the role of writers is in anything. It's though I am happy to say that I made a little contribution by doing some work with helping Jim Young Kim a bit, the wonderful in writing along some time ago about what ought to be done about the coronavirus pandemic here in the United States, and of course none of it was done. But nevertheless, the plan was laid out. I'm just tremendously relieved personally. But I come from a part of the world where, most people voted for Biden, overwhelmingly voted for Biden. And I mean, you could hear people cheering, even in my little remote village. So I don't know. I'd be more interested to hear what you all have to say. I'm sorry about Ohio, where which has a senator whom I know a little, whom I deeply admire, named Sherrod Brown. I wonder what he has to say about the sweep there. I'm so partisan, I'm sorry.
No, I think I'm feeling relieved by the recent events, but I was disappointed by what happened in Ohio. But and I think just the role of art or artists is, I don't know, to bring those stories out, to kind of process as well, like what has happened to us these past 4 years, and just kind of, yeah, bridge those divides that I think are still there and will still be there, despite the good news of recent events.
I'm not sure. I can't talk. I'm not sure what the role of the writer is. I think it's important to write about people that are often overlooked. I think particularly technology and Facebook, and now that everybody can, post something, and we have this kind of look at me culture that we ignore people who aren't deemed worthy of news, or there's a disaster and then they're deemed worthy, and then we move on while they're still trying to pick up after the disaster. So it's great as far as I'm concerned that Biden's been elected president, but it doesn't fully address the issue of forgotten people and getting their stories told. We should have been celebrating essential workers long before it became convenient to do so. And I think that's something that we should keep in mind, that lives, Black lives matter and the unnoticed lives matter, and we should make them know.
I agree wholeheartedly with you. My daughter's an emergency room doctor in Boston, and lately we're having a new renewal of what they'd finally gotten under control. And she said, I was asking her about coming to Boston myself, and she said, Dad, I don't see, none of the patients I'm seeing look like you. They're all Black or brown. And I think it's worth remembering. This is outrageous. It's just outrageous.
I have something to ask you, because all three of you have been working in creative nonfiction. And the last 4 years, there has been an issue that more overt than usual about the nature of truth, to say the least. And so I wonder if the three of you could address through your writing as an artist, the nature of truth for you, and how that, maybe propels, motivates, inspires you. Or not.
Malcolm, I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Go ahead.
No, I'd like to hear what you have to say.
I think, for me, there's a difference between truth and fact. So it's kind of walking a fine line, because I'll often interview people who say things and it's definitely their truth. They feel the government's against them or something like that. And I think it's important to represent that view, because there's a reason someone might feel that way. We may not be sympathetic to it. But I think it's, the balancing act is when we're writing about people, is getting across their truth, their way of thinking, while also hewing to certain facts. I'm probably not being particularly clear on that, but I've talked to people, the story I just read where she said, Iranians treat Afghans poorly. That's her truth, that's her experience. And I think it's important to say that, because it renders her concern for her kids even that much more poignant, because of what she sees could happen to them, even if the rest of us might say, well, how do you know that? For her, it doesn't matter. She knows it, and it's her children that are at risk.
Should I agree with that. I agree with that. I try to say this briefly. I believe in factual accuracy. I don't, and it's not the same as truth, of course, but I also, and I do think people should be allowed to speak, for themselves. And I do think that when something's in error, you point it out, doesn't mean you don't repeat it, I think there's a difference. I know that I've made mistakes. I'm sure I have. I make them all the time, but I never make them on purpose. I do think that if you're going to call something nonfiction, it ought at least to be factually accurate. I also know, though, from, and this is part of the lessons that I learned from this guy, Richard Todd. I mean, it's quite possible to write a perfectly accurate story or a piece of a story and have it be nothing but a tissue of lies, and so you have to attend to all the sides of things. You have to get tone right. It's a pretty demanding thing, writing nonfiction and still having it, particularly if it's storytelling, nonfiction of the storytelling kind.
Elise, I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, me too.
You address a lot of these questions pretty directly in Whitehorse, but also in Rust, in your own experience of truth and being believed. And I wonder if you would jump in here.
I think for me, it's always like a fascinating question. I mean, I think, reiterating what everyone has said, like there's that responsibility as a nonfiction writer to tell the facts to the best of your ability. But I think also, especially when you're writing memoir, so much is dependent on your own memory, which might be different from how someone else remembers. And I think also navigating that both through, interviewing people around you, but also I think that for me personally, I veer towards, trusting my own memory in a lot of my writing, depending on what it is. But just, and always trying to find that, seeing things from different perspectives, I think, and finding like they were saying, the truth behind kind of the factual level details as much as possible.
I'm glad to hear all this. I think the three of us at least agree. There are other schools of thought. I think with memoir, it is, that is that, of course, memory is the most plastic of our faculties. And, it's very hard to verify. But the one memoir that I wrote, and I'll never write another, was I used what I had in the way of documentary evidence. I didn't go back and try to find the men I was with in Vietnam because I knew their memories would probably be at least as faulty as mine, and probably faultier. And but I tried to be true to my memories and to render them honestly. And that took me 15 years to figure out how not to write a very dishonest book. But that's a complicated story.
I think for me, it's the fun of it too, to have, you have the pieces already and trying to find how to put them together in a way that finds that kind of deeper truth.
Elise, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the piece that Tracy read regarding telling the story as a craft and a way to go through a memory and to live on, because it seems to me like that's kind of exactly what it seems like you do. And I'm wondering if that's something that you had articulated in your own head before, or what's your relationship to that kind of approach to it?
I think definitely that idea of kind of taking the power back and making something beautiful, something that also I think has a life of its own. Like with Whitehorse, I saw, other people do readings of it, and it kind of just becomes this thing almost outside yourself. And I think that is very, powerful, and it gives you kind of that sense of control back, and that. So I think that I'm always kind of doing that with these difficult stories and pieces of my life, and trying to find, I don't know, also the way that they connect kind of to larger society, not just how they kind of affect me, but how they can affect other people as well.
And maybe all of you, all of you write in a way that the truth is there, but then there's the feelings. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how that fits into it, or what you use, what truths you choose to use in order to generate what feelings, or if you do that on purpose as a craft, or if that's just something that happens intuitively.
Pretty hard question. I think every book that I've done, every piece of writing that I've done that's nonfiction, ask for something different from me as a writer, I think. And I mean, you know, a different point of view, that's choice among tools, or tone is something that I think really matters a great deal. You know, the worst thing that can happen to a writer, it seems to me, is to have the reader start to think, you know, start to realize something about, say, a character, or you, if you're a character, that you don't seem to recognize yourself. And, you know, that whole loss of faith that a reader feels, usually just before shutting a book. I don't know. It's if that's quite what you mean. I you know, some books I've done, it seemed appropriate to make myself a small character. Others have seemed really appropriate to stay out, but doesn't mean there weren't feelings always surrounding the stories that I was trying to tell. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it doesn't. Malcolm, you've talked about this a little bit in some interviews I've read about the way that you write and putting yourself in the story to give people almost permission to feel.
You know, I had a friend who used to say feelings aren't fact, but they're real. And I've always kind of adhered to that when I write a story, because, you know, when we get to the notion of facts, you know, what makes some facts real is how people feel about the reality they're living in. Sometimes in stories, as you just mentioned, and like when I'm abroad, I'll put myself in the story because I'm, in a sense, the translator. The situation is so bizarre to an American reader who hasn't been abroad. It's so bizarre to me that sometimes I find that I can be the transition to that place. They may not fully get, you know, how a woman could be dragged out of a taxi and choked because she's trying to run detox center, but they understand me, and they can kind of ride with me through this thing. And when I say that I'm, you know, blown away by what I'm seeing, it allows the reader to say, you know, okay, you know, then what I'm feeling isn't strange, that this is truly peculiar and outside my experience. So that's been one reason why I put myself in a story.
I think I know, you know, when I'm doing my writing, and I so often kind of mine these very personal experiences, and I feel like oftentimes I won't want to put the feelings in there, and I'll just write. And then when I go back and read it, it just reads so false. And so I think sometimes I'll have to just kind of force myself to mine that emotional depth, and because if it doesn't have that emotional truth, it's just not there for me, at least.
I could say one other thing that about sort of what Malcolm was talking about. For me, if I once wrote a book about a rather noble fellow. I mean, of course, he was just human, but he was a person so smart, so passionate about a cause, and so self-sacrificing that it was clear at a certain point that everybody who read about this guy was going to really be irritated. And so I felt pretty strongly it wasn't just my idea that he needed that there had to be a companion. And I didn't have to make this person up, it was me, but I had to bring myself into the story in my own little bout with his outsized virtue. So there was a little sub-story there, but I think the idea was to be a kind of everyman, to say, in fact, I know this person's making you feel uncomfortable, he's making me feel uncomfortable too, and here's what I think about that. You know, and I think it worked all right, you know. And it was honest, it was true.
Well, it's 4 o'clock and our hour is up, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity if there's anything else you'd like to say, or if there's a burning thought you'd like to leave us with, please do.
It's 8 o'clock here. I gotta eat. It's wonderful to be with all of you. Really enjoyed it.
It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you, for your work and your voices, and for supporting AQR during this benefit series. It's very generous of you all to give us an hour of your time and expertise, and I've learned a lot listening to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night,
Yeah, and I
Good night,
also
Ron.
thank you, and I want to thank all of you that have joined us today for this continuing series in AQR's 40th anniversary, and to ask you to please consider, those of you that have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have, and you must all have, a donation to AQR, and also to thank Adam and the staff at the Anchorage Museum at the Rasmussen Center for producing the show, and to join us next Sunday, where we're going to have Emily Wall and Lance Tritcher and Dina Reeder and Sophie McCall, all in a discussion of Indigenous writing. They're all writers and teachers, and that should be a real special program as well. So thank you very much, and
Thank you, everyone.
we'll see you next week.